Ms. Marr, your public statements and social media posts reflect left-wing ideology and blatant opposition to free speech. After all, you were the head of Wikipedia for many years, which is a platform that doesn't tell the truth. Let's walk through some of your statements so the public can understand your personal views. You said your fellow Americans just elected Donald Trump as president again this past November. You called him a deranged racist and sociopath. You posted on X that America is addicted to white supremacy. It's appalling. You've publicly chastised using the phrase boy and girl, which you said erases the language for non-binary people. There's only two genders, by the way. Ms. Marr, the federal funding that your outlet receives comes from all American taxpayer dollars, not just from your viewers who support such statements as these. Let me inform you, and that your federal funding is also paid for by the other half of the country.
We started this show with Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was haranguing Catherine Marr, the former head of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And this is the Dying in Darkness edition. Today, we're going to be talking about conservative media. I'm your host, Claire Potter.
And I'm Neil Young.
So on Monday, we learned that a New York Times team has been doing a forensic examination of the Epstein files, teasing out a long relationship between the J.P. Morgan Bank and possible sex trafficking on the part of Jeffrey Epstein. Jamie Dimon, who is always in and out of Congress and in the news and has all kinds of aspirations to glory, claims to have known nothing about one of his most lucrative clients. However, his closest assistant was the conduit between Epstein and the bank, and other employees flagged large cash withdrawals, a trigger for sex trafficking or other organized crime activity, warnings that were never followed up. Neil, is Jeffrey Epstein ever going to get out of the news?
I don't think so. And I mean, there's also, Trump's in the UK this week. There's all those public art displays that are being made, like the largest photo ever.
Yep.
Put on a public space. It feels like Jeffrey Epstein is never going to be out of the news, and also that we may never have any sort of concrete evidence or, I suppose, real legal action taken here in terms of some of the names that we imagine are implicated in this story, right?
I think that's absolutely right. Part of what I think is a red flag about this story is that there were mid-level, maybe even upper-level employees who were saying, hey, what's going on with these large cash withdrawals? And of course, now, during the Trump administration, we're seeing all kinds of very odd activity. Tiffany Trump was in the news this morning because her husband apparently has been dealing in yachts, and not very honestly at that. But also, of course, the Trump administration has been pushing Bitcoin and all kinds of other meme coin activity, which allows people to pay for things without any accountability at all. So it is worrisome, I think, that one of the most prominent banks in the United States actually had systems to catch this stuff, and it was ignored.
Yeah, it doesn't inspire confidence. And it also, I think you're right to point us to the cryptocurrency conversation, which we know the Trump family has benefited from enormously financially, but also what are the other benefits of this particular currency in terms of what you can hide and also like just how unregulated that space is and what that allows for.
Yeah. And of course, Woodward and Bernstein coined the famous phrase, follow the money.
Right.
It seems to me that anybody following the money for Jeffrey Epstein in the pre-crypto era may exactly find the connections that everybody claims they're looking for. So let's move on to Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson, who has lost yet another seat from his historically itty bitty, teeny weeny majority. A special election in Virginia's 11th, which is a deep blue district, no surprises here, did their duty and elected Democrat James Walkinshaw to replace Gerald Connolly, who died earlier this year. What are the things that are important about this story, Neil?
Well, I think that first of all, it seems to be there's a pretty clear pattern in these special elections that Democrats are faring really well. And I think we've talked about a number of them over the last couple of months, which seems, good news for 2026 and the way in which midterm elections can like push back on the Trump administration, maybe alter Congress. But it's also worth talking about any of these special elections in the bigger context of what the Republican Party is also doing, which is like these gerrymandering efforts in Texas and elsewhere. So there's a lot at play here. I'm sure Johnson isn't happy about, a result like this. And also, there's a lot of efforts from Johnson, the Republican Party, towards creating a political scenario to guard against results like this through, gerrymandering congressional districts.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's good that the Democrats are locking down seats where they can. I think it's also important to point out that Virginia is traditionally thought of as kind of a bellwether, and we have a governor's election coming up in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, the year after Joe Biden was elected, the election of Glenn Youngkin was not a good sign for Democrats, and everybody talked about that. But can we imagine that Virginia is still the bellwether that it is, given what you're talking about, given the gerrymandering, given what's happening in the media?
I don't know that it is. I do think it's right to continue to talk about Virginia as a purple state in a way that like some purple states aren't that, and Florida used to be a purple state, or Ohio used to be a purple state. It seems like Virginia is still one in which like things could go either way, but whether or not that represents it being a bellwether state, I don't know that those two things are one and the same, right? I don't know that a purple state and what it does necessarily means it's also a bellwether of larger national trends.
Yeah. And of course, these districts that are around Washington, D.C., I'm not sure anybody really knows how to forecast for them right now because it is the home to so many people who have been fired and may, in fact, have left, may never vote in Virginia again. On the other hand, it is also communities that have been torn apart by Trump firing people in the federal
Absolutely.
government. It may activate voters. So really, we don't know. And we're going to have to keep watching Virginia very closely this year, Neil, which is one of the things we do best. So in the department of good things happen to bad people, on Wednesday, a Manhattan judge threw out federal terrorism charges filed in the Luigi Mangione case, a decision that not only has ramifications for Charlie Kirk assassin Tyler Robinson, but for Donald Trump's announced determination to use terrorism designations against a range of foundations that have historically funded liberal causes. Neil, what else do we need to be thinking about here?
Well, I think that that last point that you made is really what's important here, is that we have a concerted effort from the Trump administration to sort of push this as a legal strategy or as a legal category for these cases that, I think the judge in this case, which, doesn't mean it's not a murder case, doesn't mean it's not a horrific event that happened, but that didn't meet the statute definition of what terrorism is under New York law. But the Trump administration obviously is going to continue to push that because the Charlie Kirk events have just, I think, encouraged that sort of framing. It's certainly happening in political discourse on the right. And so I think it'll be mirrored in legal strategies as well.
Yeah. And of course, Trump is eager to start executing people. That seems to be one of his goals for his second administration. Apparently, there's something like 600 lives at stake. People who have been convicted under federal laws and are appealing death penalty sentences. So this strikes me as a moment in which a federal judge is stepping in to say, hold on here, we're not going down this route. I do think what you're saying, Neil, about the broadening of the category of terrorism is extremely important because you and I take terrorism very seriously. We have differently, I think, been affected by terrorism. 9/11. Somebody set off a bomb in my neighborhood in Chelsea a few years ago, and it was possibly one of the most terrifying things that has ever happened, to me at least. But the idea that anything that is counter to the MAGA agenda represents a form of terrorism seems to be what the White House is playing with here, right?
Yeah, I mean, just to add my personal connection to, I mean, I worked across the street from the World Trade Center when 9/11 happened, as a, in my first job out of college, having just moved to New York. So yes, this feels very close to home for so many of us who've lived through and seen with our own eyes, terrorist events. And also, I think any American should be concerned about the way in which the Trump administration is handling and broadening this category of terrorism. And also, we should remember what else they have done, which is to exonerate anyone involved in January 6th activities.
Actual terrorism.
Actual terrorism. So as we talk about them sort of expanding this category, expanding it in particular ways, expanding it through a sort of political strategy that they're pursuing through the courts at the same time in which they have, Trump has pardoned actual terrorists. And so I think like all of this is of a piece, but it's very worth remembering that January 6th history as we go forward. And as this administration, I think, will try and use that terrorist language over and over again to broaden and extend its powers, and to suppress civil liberties and all sorts of other things.
Yeah. And to go back to money just for a second, of course, there are U.S. laws that prohibit the use of the American financial system to support terrorism. We're not allowed to donate money to organizations that support terrorism and so on. There is a part of me that thinks, the administration figured out how to loot universities. They figured out how to loot media companies. And now they're trying to loot the foundations, which is really big money. I mean, places like Mellon and Soros and Ford and so on, and groups that have historically promoted humanitarian and liberal causes. There are billions and billions and billions of dollars there. And if the Department of Justice goes after them for quote unquote supporting terrorism, that will be expensive and difficult litigation. Okay, on a lighter note, news surfaced last week. And I just want to say, listeners, Neil and I were going to do this episode last week, and then Charlie Kirk happened. So we kicked everything forward. That's why some of the news is a little older, but I like this piece of news. News surfaced last week that there's been a happy ending for the recently widowed 81-year-old right-wing pundit Oliver North. A former Marine and national security aide in the Reagan administration, North's testimony about the illegal Iran-Contra arms for hostages, or cocaine for arms for hostages, however you want to have it, deal electrified the nation in 1987. His bride is, wait for it, former secretary and part-time model Fawn Hall, who admitted to destroying evidence in the case. She is now 65, and I guess they're happy together, right, Neil?
I mean, is this a beautiful ending?
It is.
The good news we needed in these awful times? Also, does this sort of cause us to revisit those events and say that there was something going, right? Like this seems like there was clearly something going on there, that they've now found each other again. Best of luck to them. God bless, and hope they have a great honeymoon. I think I'd forgotten that there was such an age difference between the two of them, but that, it does make sense. But 81 years old and getting married to the love of your life. I mean, I guess we should wish that for everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of cute. Well, you remember at the time, there was something in the middle of all those hearings about a receipt from a lingerie store.
Yes. Yep.
Unclear who the lingerie was for, and he said it was really for his wife, but we didn't really believe that. And of course, Fawn Hall was like sneaking documents out in her cooch, and it was really quite a scene at the time. But you're right, we should be happy for them. I don't know whether Oliver North's children are happy for him, because apparently they read the news in the newspaper.
Wow.
Yeah, not good. Okay, so let's get to our focus, Neil. How Republicans are trying to reshape media to promote a right-wing agenda and silence liberals. I think we should start with the most recent news, which is that the Walt Disney Company, under FCC pressure, is suspending comedian Jimmy Kimmel's late night show on ABC for these words in his opening monologue. And I want to say the words because it makes a difference. We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points from it. Neil, is what Jimmy Kimmel said false?
I don't know if we know all the information yet to truly say if this is true or false, but it's not a lie, right? I mean, I also don't know if this is the test that we need to apply to it given what's going on. I understand the sort of, if we fact check this and it's true, then it really shouldn't have happened. But whether or not it's true, I don't think changes how awful what's happening is. That this is a absolute infringement on free expression that is chilling because of how visible this person is, and also what we know, the pressure that the president is exerting on media companies to do stuff like this. I mean, I imagine that this is a big story nationally. It's the only thing that people are talking about here in LA. Like, you can literally walk down the street and hear other people talking about it because it is of such profound consequence for a city like this. But it's deeply consequential for all of us because of what it represents and the real authoritarian grab that continues to happen here from the Trump administration and the collusion of major, the cooperation of major media organizations with what Trump wants here.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder two things, and they don't lead to the same conclusion. One thing I'm thinking about is whether media companies are sort of saying to each other when the doors are closed, can we just get back to work? We can't get in another tangle with the Trump administration and actually do our job. So they're kind of desperately maneuvering to try and get their jobs done. Another piece of me thinks that there are people in these media companies who for some time have wanted to shut down more liberal speech, and now they're getting the opportunity. And then there's another piece of me that thinks, late night shows don't actually make that much money.
Yeah.
And they're kind of an albatross for these media companies because they have very low viewership. They don't get that much advertising, but they are extremely popular because of the capacity to spread the performances across social media platforms. So there are a great many more people that listen to Jimmy Kimmel on YouTube or Instagram or whatever than actually watch the show. So I sometimes wonder if media companies are saying, I don't want to go to war for a property that actually isn't that valuable.
Yeah. And also, they tend to be hosted by folks who have really big money contracts. So I don't know if, there are some cost savings here of getting rid of Stephen Colbert, getting rid of Kimmel, and the sort of multi-year, multi-million-dollar contracts they have, especially if those shows aren't as revenue producing as say the morning programming is. But yeah, I mean, none of this is good. And I think, a comedian who's fired over a joke is incredibly troubling on its own. But again, let's remember the bigger context of who these people are and what their politics are. All the years that we had to hear of comedians being canceled by the woke left. There was a whole political movement built around that in so many ways Trump energized and benefited from.
Right.
The discourse of free expression and free speech that we're hearing that I think has been very animating on the right and very animating for Trump and for his movement. And that has been supercharged in this Charlie Kirk moment. And literally they're calling for people to be fired for saying anything about Charlie Kirk.
Right.
Even as they talk about him as being killed because of his advocacy for free speech. I mean, we have to bring all of these things together in these conversations and speak to them because there's a concerted effort to sort of not connect those dots because for, this political gains that not connecting those dots provides to Trump and his ilk.
Right. Well, and I think it leads us to something that we need to keep thinking about during this conversation, which is the extreme right's capacity to confuse us by contradicting itself.
Hmm.
So when you were talking about how outraged they were about right-wing comedians getting canceled, there's also this other thing that's been going on in social media for years, which is somebody would put up a racist meme or a transphobic joke or something. And then when you came back at them and said, this is bigoted, they said, it's just a
It's
joke.
just a joke. Just kidding.
Right. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Everything was just a joke. But it seems that nothing that a liberal or a left wing person can say is a joke. And I would also say Kimmel's observation that the MAGA media sphere was in fact trying to concoct a false view of this young person as being part of a left wing conspiracy, could not possibly be one of us, could not possibly be on the right, blah, 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 when in fact we knew nothing. And so they jumped into a big space in which there was no information and began to invent information. And that's where I think Kimmel was right on target. And where some of these late night guys have historically, really back since 2012, 2014, they've been making a real contribution by telling truth in the form of stand-up comedy and improv.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, a lot of Americans have gone to Colbert and to Kimmel as in part as sort of their source of news. And, I think a lot of us have worried about what that meant,
Right.
for traditional media and just the industry of journalism and all the rest. And also have sort of appreciated the way in which folks like Kimmel and Colbert and forgetting John, the Daily Show guy,
Jon Stewart.
Jon Stewart, thank you, that like they also took their opportunities seriously. They knew they had big audiences and that there was a way in which through humor, they could engage serious content and make, important commentary. But I just sort of want to circle back to the point you raised that's really important here about the sort of just joking defense that really rose through the first Trump administration and that we see emerging again here. And like the gross disparity between a president and a presidential administration sort of defending and even downplaying so much of what the president of the United States says as just joking, and
Right.
then holding a comedian to standards that don't allow for the very thing they do, which is humor and
Mm-hmm.
joke telling. And that is a insane disparity and just a crazy apples and oranges scenario. But I mean, I actually wrote a column during the first Trump administration, about how much that White House put out a just joking defense about the president, what it meant to have the leader of the free world, his words downplayed and characterized as just joking so much. And then we have, a comedian losing their job for a joke.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I actually want to be clear. I want to attribute this to you, Neil, but President Trump lies all the time. Charlie Kirk lied all the time. And, I don't want to make too fine a point on it. The man is dead. We are sorry about it. We abhor violence, but it is also true that Charlie Kirk lied all the time about Black people, about women, about LGBT people. He lied about the political system. He invented conspiracies that utterly avoided the facts of political life. And so Jimmy Kimmel's, I'm not even offended by what Jimmy Kimmel said. It just seems right to me. But I think, what you're saying about why people went to late night, they go to late night for the kind of sharp elbowed political critique that rarely occurs in the mainstream media, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really true. And you wonder what the future of that format is and what it means for ABC's strategy going forward. I mean, we shall see. It could be that decisions made there. I mean, is he never coming back? We don't know that yet, right? I mean, we don't really
They
know
have
what
not
this.
said.
Okay,
My guess is they are in heavy talks with his agent right now
I would imagine
because
so.
Kimmel has a contract. I mean, it's important to remember that Stephen Colbert's contract was not renewed.
Right.
Kimmel is in the middle of a contract. And so if he is canceled, ABC is in breach of contract and they have to do something about that. And my guess, there's something written into that contract that is very, very, very expensive. But there's something more important here that is framing this conservative war on the media, which is the First Amendment. It's not just affecting media people. CBS News recently reported a wave of firing across industries, punishing people for First Amendment protected wrong speak about Charlie Kirk. Republicans have urged people to turn in their colleagues, to report their teachers, to get as many people fired as possible who say something about Charlie Kirk that is not utterly laudatory. So it's a media problem, but we've also got a legal and a social problem here, right?
Absolutely. And I have to say, even as someone who follows a lot of the folks here that are engaged in this right now, who thinks about a lot of the history behind what's happening here, I have to say, I don't know about you, Claire, but I'm actually surprised by how widespread and how vengeful what we're seeing is. Just DeSantis in Florida has called for public school teachers to be found and fired for any expressions about Charlie Kirk. And that's obviously being replicated in other places and across all sorts of different sectors. But the sort of mass campaign of finding and firing folks and the real coordination that's happening here is on a level that I actually find shocking, even as I spend a lot of time thinking about, conservative media, conservative politics, and all the rest. This is, I think it's really stunning how big this is.
I agree with you. And, some of my friends on the right are acting, at least on X, like they are losing their minds. And the only reason I can forgive them or excuse them for this at all is I'm actually quite sure that there are media strategies that are coming out of the White House that are being distributed to social media and other media operatives that say, this is the story, because it all looks the same. They're all saying the same things. They're all pointing us in the same direction. But I think what we need to think about, and this really weaves in other episodes we've done, Neil, is that the Trump administration is trying to reshape the society and the culture, and that going after media in this way is part of that project. One of the things that Trump has done is sue newspapers. Last week, he sued the New York Times for, what was it, $15 billion?
That's right.
He is suing not just the Times, but 4 reporters and Penguin Random House of having tried to influence the 2024 election by spreading false and defamatory content about him and for endorsing Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
That's part of the lawsuit, that the New York Times never should have endorsed Kamala Harris, which sort of casts a new light on why some other newspapers backed off their endorsements. Like, did they get a phone call that said, we're going to sue you if you do this? Who knows? In July, we know that Trump also filed suit against the Wall Street Journal over its reporting on the Epstein birthday book. Now, this is reporting. This is fact-based reporting, and he's suing people for doing it. What do you think is going to follow, Neil? These suits can't possibly succeed.
Yeah, they're not going to succeed in a court of law, right? But that's not the only way in which this strategy, operates and has success. I mean, it is also a tool of intimidation. And we know that this fits within Trump's very, very long history, well before he was the president, long through his career as a businessman, using lawsuits to intimidate and to get what he wanted, even if he didn't win in court. And so, again, it's consistent with that pattern. I think you're absolutely right to raise the question of whether this was a factor in places like the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times in not printing the presidential endorsements, which was historic that didn't happen, which, that's a basic thing that newspapers do. And so I think it's a very fair question, given the suit against the New York Times that included this complaint, that a call was made, that intimidation was made that stopped that from happening. So, I mean, I imagine that this might even get thrown out. It might even not even go to trial. Do we know what stage we're in yet? Has it gone to trial yet, or is this just a suit, right?
This is just a lawsuit that has been filed. The Wall Street Journal thing, since it happened in July, is probably a little farther ahead.
Yeah, it is.
But I would say the point is that Trump makes these big announcements. One of the things that is a feature of the way the right and the Trump administration blitzes the news in these ways is that people lose track of stories. So all they will remember is the New York Times lied about Donald Trump and manipulated the election. That will be the headline. And I think Trump is very adept at imprinting these headlines in people's minds by doing dramatic things that to the rest of us look sort of idiotic. And, there was sort of another dramatic moment during the campaign. And this to me suggests the ways in which Trump is also using the media as a stage for his performances. We all probably recall that Donald Trump attacked Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris at the National Association of Black Journalists conference. And more broadly, his attacks on diversity undermine the vitality of the news environment when it comes to having a robust representation of people of color. But the attack on Harris at the National Association of Black Journalists conference was calculated, right? He couldn't have expected to have been cheered for that, right?
Yeah, I think, this is a person who has been incredibly obsessed with media his whole life and has been very savvy in how he's used media for his advantage. A lot of that for the early part of his career was just in making a name for himself in New York, and also in how he intimidated, business rivals and on and so he's been honing this strategy for a long time. And, I think in so many ways, we see the real implications of that for us today on the national stage and the political stage. But this just it grows out of a long tradition that he has of using the media really sort of strategically to his advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it also taps into and builds upon a larger conservative obsession with the media that dates back to the 1950s, as the media as a sort of monolithic liberal institution that was corrupting society and on and on. So there's a lot of things converging here, like a bigger sort of history that's tied to a political movement, right, and a person's own, personal biography and the way in which, he built a name for himself and a career.
It's so interesting, Neil. I was just thinking about this as you were talking. So this isn't in our show notes for today, but the right has so many big media figures. They had Phyllis Schlafly. They had Rush Limbaugh. They had William F. Buckley. They had Pat Buchanan. They had Charlie Kirk. The Democrats have Rachel Maddow. Why are the Democrats so bad at media, despite the fact that media in this country, the mainstream media, has historically been quite liberal, and conservatives are so good at media?
Yeah, and it's hard to even really compare Rachel Maddow to some of those names. Even that doesn't really work as a comparison,
right?
And it's a big question that I think a lot of media scholars and historians have spilled a lot of ink over through the years. So why does this happen?
Right.
Is it that given the sort of leaning, sort of left of center leanings of traditional media, if that's the case, does that then not inspire a particular voice to arise as a sort of organizing character in the way that these folks as sort of outsiders are able to mobilize an identity and an audience behind them, mm-hmm, because they sort of are set against that establishment norm of liberal media? I mean, maybe it's that. Is it also just sort of a personality type and a sort of psychological type, mm-hmm, that is more constituted on the right than on the left, that really works for a media space and for, again, becoming a sort of media figure that inspires enormous audiences behind them? I mean, there is this recurring conversation on the left about we need to have our own Rush Limbaugh, right? Or we need to
Right.
have our own like for every sort of media age, there's been that sort of liberal or left like moment of like we need our own guy, that does
Right.
this. And it never seems to materialize. And so I think it's just an ongoing, it's a question that still hasn't been answered. But yeah, I mean, I think, partly it's about media culture and media structures, and partly I think it might be also about sort of political psychology and political, and
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And, when I mentioned Rachel Maddow, I was sitting here thinking, Rachel Maddow every Monday tells you a nice story about political economy that's super smart, very well spoken, very passionate, and so on. And then Laura Loomer gets on TikTok and tells you about the vast conspiracy that is going to turn your children transgender and kick Donald Trump out of the White House. The difference between these two kinds of stories is vast, but it does also strike me that in a country that is less and less interested in or has less and less access to education, the audience for a particular kind of successful liberal media is shrinking, and the audience for conservative media is growing.
right. Yeah. And that audience includes people who don't necessarily think of themselves as conservatives or are registered as Republicans, but because of the nature of media technology, and the distribution model and the content of it, that it's wildly inviting and expansive at a moment of institutional neglect, sort of media free fall, assaults on expertise, and all the rest.
Yeah, and you can also consume conservative media in small bites very effectively. They're very adept at, as I said earlier, just giving you headlines. You really can't reduce a Rachel Maddow opening monologue, which is usually between 15 and 20 minutes, uninterrupted by a commercial. You can't reduce that to a series of TikTok videos or an Instagram. Whereas you can take Ben Shapiro destroys whoever,
Yeah.
Elizabeth Warren. You can take that and reduce it to about 30 or 45 seconds, and it's got all the meat that anybody needs. But, the original stage, and partly, I don't want to say, where's our Rush Limbaugh? I want to say, where is our Roger Ailes?
Mm.
Because the big story for me last week that got bumped by Charlie Kirk was an end to the succession drama at the Murdoch media empire, which includes valuable conservative outlets like Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Post, as well as properties in England and Australia, basically like the whole English-speaking world. Lachlan Murdoch, who I think is the younger son, finally did what his father told him to do in the first place, which was to buy out his siblings for over $1 billion apiece. They'll be happy at last, but it secures the company's right-wing political influence in the English-speaking world for the next several decades. And that's what Rupert Murdoch really cared about, was that this conservative media empire survived. I've also noticed since this deal that the Trump administration has been more or less using Fox properties as its RT in relation to the Charlie Kirk assassination. That it's the New York Post. He announced the fact that they had a suspect in custody on the Fox morning show, Fox and Friends. So is Fox really becoming the official state channel for the Trump administration?
Yeah, it feels like it. And I think, this succession decision is important to that. I also think, in the first Trump administration, as much as Trump relied on and depended on Fox News for so much of his rise to political power, he spent a lot of that first administration really holding Fox News's feet to the fire and sort of haranguing them. And, there was a big growth in these channels that sort of grew to the right of Fox News that I think put real pressure on Fox News. I'm now forgetting the name of all of them. Wasn't one of them like One America? And
Yeah.
That grew enormous audiences. And of course, they were growing audiences off of people leaving Fox. So I think Fox felt both the pressure of Trump himself and of like an audience that was shifting in that first administration. that they're spending a lot of energy and correcting on in this one. But it does feel like there's always been a close coordination between the Trump White House and Fox News, but it feels really, really intimately connected right now.
Right. Well, and we see Trump embedded in Fox News, which is now locked down. We see the emergence, as you're saying, of these channels, many of which are really just internet channels that are to the right of Fox. But what we're also seeing is liberal media ceding ground, creating space, not pushing back. In February, we began to see this happen when Washington Post owner Jeff Bezos announced a new editorial policy that would prioritize content, quote, defending personal liberties and free markets, accelerating departures from the Post that had begun as downsizing through layoffs and buyouts in late 2023. Ruth Marcus left, Jonathan Capehart has left. So there is this sort of ceding of ground by news organizations that gives the Trump administration more space to tell its own story.
Absolutely. I mean, just sort of the center has shifted, right? And it's also shifted rightward. So it's not just a story about what's happening sort of in, places that call themselves conservative media, but what's happening across the media landscape in terms of content, editorial positions, and the stories that are being told and the stories that aren't being told. I mean, also Washington Post, Karen Attiah was fired this past week because of literally quoting Charlie Kirk,
right,
in a tweet. I believe it was a tweet she sent out, using his own words. And Karen Attiah, a very well-known and well-regarded Black journalist at the Washington Post, was immediately fired there. So lots of things are happening at the Post. And I think you're right that this is about a broader media shift across a wide range of publications and news outlets that reflect some sort of kowtowing to Trump and to Trumpism.
Right. No, I think I'm glad you mentioned Attiah. She was the last Black person at the Washington Post opinion section. And, the Wall Street Journal, to the best of my knowledge, has no one Black writing for them in the opinion section regularly. The New York Times does. Jamel Bowie, and who's that wonderful woman who writes on foreign policy? Anyway, but there is this sort of peeling away of not just liberal journalism, but of what we valued in a diverse journalism workforce, which is people bringing competing ideas to the table. And it is ironic that that Republicans used to actually care about free markets, they used to care about free speech, and they used to care about competing ideas. And now when you compete with ideas, you actually get shut down and punished. I would also say that in the next week, we will see the complete defunding of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. We began with the hearings that led to that. And one of the things Republicans kept saying was that the relevance of traditional news organizations is really on the decline. During the CPB hearings, Louisiana Republican Senator John Kennedy emphasized this. He said that the Americans have moved on, that they can be informed by an array of things on the internet. They don't need radio. They don't need television. They don't need traditional news organizations. They can just do their own research on the internet. Neil, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think you're right about what's going to happen there. I think this is a sort of convenient argument on the part of Kennedy. He doesn't really mean that. Or rather, that's not what this is really about. This is about, hacking an institution that conservatives have long had in their crosshairs. And we've talked about the CPB several times on here, particularly the ways in which, it's always been this sort of boogeyman on the right in terms of it being, this liberal content maker. But as we know, and we've talked about, it's also what brings weather updates to rural America. And in many, many places is the one source of any sort of information, which is to say that all of this is assault on actually some of the basic ways in which so many Americans get news. Right. And so this sort of argument on Kennedy's part that there's all these opportunities for Americans to consume news from all sorts of different sources isn't true for a lot of Americans.
Right. Well, and let's focus in a little bit on how Trump is actually using these traditional news organizations to try to shift the discourse. And let's focus in on Paramount. There's a dynamic here which Trump sues a major corporation, and in exchange for dropping the lawsuit, they not only pay through the nose, but they agree to do certain kinds of things. So when the Trump administration was suing CBS, that was an impediment to the $8.4 billion merger between Paramount Global and Skydance. That had been hanging fire for over 2 years, and the Federal Trade Commission didn't want to approve it. Sherry Redstone was screwing it up. A bunch of stuff was going on. But when Trump settled his lawsuit against CBS News, or at least CBS News's news division, they committed $16 million to Trump's future presidential library. More importantly, they made changes in their editorial policy as part of the settlement. Skydance also promised prior to the merger's approval to install an ombudsperson to evaluate charges of bias at the network. That person is Kenneth Weinstein, a Trump donor and a former head of the conservative Hudson Institute. This is just crazy pants, Neil.
It is crazy pants. And I think that, the editorial policy changes that CBS said that it will do include things like it will now print the entire transcript of interviews it does with. And in some ways, I think we can say like, okay, this feels like maybe a good move for openness and for transparency. But that's a move that should happen, if it happens at all, because of the internal decision making of a media company and what it wants to do in terms of its content and how it shares information with the world, not through, governmental intimidation and demand. I mean, I suppose some of this maybe just falls under FCC regulatory powers, but it seems like a real incursion on the First Amendment, I think, is the way to think about this. And also the, decision of someone like this, is it Weinstein, rather, to be, the ombudsman for Skydance. I mean, to evaluate charges of bias, it's going to be very interesting to see what his list of examples of biases are that emerge in the coming months. I imagine it's going to be of a very particular politics and won't be sort of wide and expansive.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. I also think that what an ombudsperson is, that generally is an internal job.
Right.
It is not something that you actually get to complain, that you and I get to call CBS and say, we don't like the way that story went. So it's not altogether clear what this person's job is. But there's another conservative who's going to have a corner office at CBS too, and that's Barry Weiss, whose Free Press Substack is in contract, I think, for a $200 million payout. And then Weiss is supposed to be installed in an editorial position at CBS News. First of all, this is a dramatic change in fortunes for Barry Weiss, going from being trashed at the New York Times by her colleagues 3 years ago to a $200 million payout and an executive position at a major news organization. But what does it mean to actually have the government mandating that a media company hire conservatives? What does that mean for the rest of us, Neil?
Well, on one hand, it means that the First Amendment is under direct assault. It also means in terms of the content that we're going to see is going to be in coordination with a presidential administration in service of that administration. So how do we not call this state media? And how is this not the very thing that we would point to in different countries around the world as the exact of how those places are not free? And so it's a stunning development. I also think, just to talk about the Barry Weiss of it all, I mean, she was someone, when she left the New York Times, which she did on her own volition, let's remember.
Right.
She could have stayed there forever, could have continued to write what I think was not very interesting or compelling op-ed pieces, and probably was paid quite well to do so. But she left because she said, the place was not hospitable to her ideas. And she went, to sort of pursue and to develop the Free Press as this sort of anti-institutional thing that operated outside, the terrain of traditional media. So for her to so quickly end up back at a perch like CBS News is to say that like that critique and that sort of personal statement of what her career was about and represented was like just a scam all along. She just like, it's hard to not see this as just like following a money trail, which involves a lot of grift. But like to leave the New York Times in such a sort of like anti-institutional, like, a traditional media is corrupt and we have to operate outside of it. And then to end up as the director of CBS News is to sort of just give a lie to it all, isn't it?
Well, it certainly gives a lie to it. It is also very Trumpy in the sense that somebody who has worked as a columnist, has run a Substack with a staff of 20 or 25 people, might now be in charge of a news organization of hundreds of people that do things that she doesn't understand. She's never been a broadcast journalist. She's never been a producer. She's never actually worked in that environment. And so it's very Trumpy, the idea that you can just sort of plug somebody in who's a conservative and they're going to do a great job. I think people at CBS must be stabbing their eyes out with a fork at this point. And my guess is we're going to see a lot of people departing CBS, which is, of course, also how transformation happens. I mean,
Right.
Trump didn't have to fire everybody in government that got fired. A lot of people left because they didn't want to stay and deal with it. And so I think there's going to be a lot of volatility in the media industry in the next few years.
Absolutely.
So, Neil, as media entrepreneurs, what do we want to go viral this week? You start.
I want to go viral this week. This really fantastic and interesting and really sort of scary piece in the New Republic by Gil Duran. The piece is titled, "What's Up with Peter Thiel's Obsession with the Antichrist?" Subtitle, "The tech mogul is amping up his apocalyptic rhetoric and adding a dangerous dose of extremism into the already fraught culture war." I was sort of generally aware of this preoccupation of Thiel. Thiel, for I think probably everyone knows, the tech billionaire, gay, far right backer of JD Vance and a huge advocate for Trump and a real funder of like far right political efforts in the last decade or so, has really sort of positioned himself as a public intellectual in recent years. But I guess public intellectual isn't really right. He's sort of a private intellectual to a very cultivated world, mostly of like other tech billionaires and conservative activists. And he is obsessed with the Antichrist and apparently has been giving not only sort of public talks about this, which I was generally aware of, but apparently a lot of private lectures to Silicon Valley folks about the Antichrist. And this piece does a really nice job of sort of historicizing that and of pointing to how in American political culture, the figure of the Antichrist has been this recurrent, motif, like this recurrent is recurringly invoked, usually in moments of great political and cultural upheaval, right? So figures are often called the Antichrist in these moments of crisis because it's a sort of unifying thing to be done, whether it's Mussolini or FDR or social security numbers. It's not always people. Like sometimes it's things that are called the Antichrist.
But Neil, I have to interrupt you. Can you tell our listeners who the Antichrist is? Because I had to look it up. I did not know.
Okay. Well,
I thought the Antichrist was Satan.
No,
but it's not.
Thank you for saying this because I assume that all of y'all grew up in evangelical Sunday school like I did. The Antichrist is not Satan, but rather a shadowy figure that's actually hardly mentioned at all in the Bible, but through, I think, a lot more sort of religious legend and sort of lots of evangelicals and fundamentalist pop culture throughout history. The Antichrist is a figure who will rise up and help Satan kick off Armageddon.
So he's like Satan's boyfriend.
Satan's figure on earth that will coordinate that. And also that he or they or whatever, will consolidate a global government under their authority, and will wreak havoc on the world, but particularly on Christian believers, right? But that will bring about Armageddon. And so anyway, this has been a figure that has been invoked over and over again through history. Peter Thiel is apparently incredibly preoccupied with this and is really devoting so much attention to this in his circles. And I think that this piece does a really nice job of both sort of historicizing that tendency and also thinking about, like, what does it mean that a tech billionaire whose one of his companies is a surveillance company that is now working in coordination with this federal government, what does it mean that such a figure would be obsessed with the Antichrist? Because in many ways, Peter Thiel himself sort of ticks a lot of the boxes of what people have traditionally thought of, like who the Antichrist might be.
Oh my
the piece
God.
is the piece is fantastic. It's like deeply historical and like has a lot of really smart insights. So people should read it.
So I loved it. And I loved it because it made me look up what the Antichrist was. Because when I saw it, I thought, oh, Antichrist equals Satan. And it's like, no, the Antichrist is not at all Satan. But tell me if I overread this. Peter Thiel thinks that the Antichrist might be Greta Thunberg, right?
Well, that's one name that he has tossed out before.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, the piece makes the point that like names get tossed out all the time through history.
Right.
But that it's always a really dangerous thing to do so, because the sort of resolution of so much of this energy is a consolidation of diverse people into a really violent and vengeful, you know, series of actions. And so it is like really harmful to invoke Antichrist sort of discourse in general, but particularly when it's directed at certain people, it can really take violent ends and sort of stirs up like the sort of darkest motivations of a society.
I loved this article, Neil, and I second your desire that our listeners read it. Okay, so for me this week, it's Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in Vanity Fair, Charlie Kirk Redeemed, A Political Class Finds Its Lost Cause. And unintimidated by the ire that is being aimed at anybody who says anything about Charlie Kirk that is real, Coates does the work that many writers are too lazy or too afraid to do. It's a long read, and it counters the narrative that Kirk, quote, did politics the right way, Ezra Klein's worst column ever, and that he engaged in reasonable debates. And Coates shows how Kirk wove bigotry and hatred into an existing conservative narrative about faith, family, and white supremacy. One quote from the article, he says, "What are we to make of a man who called for the execution of the American president and then was executed himself?" In fact, Charlie Kirk called for the execution of Joe Biden. But what Coates does in a way that is very, very powerful is he pulls quotes over and over and over again, what Charlie Kirk really said about Black people, what he really said about trans people, and that a lot of his rhetoric was extremely violent. Again, I repeat myself, none of this excuses a political assassination, but people aren't wrong to have not liked Charlie Kirk. People are not wrong to have feared Charlie Kirk, and people are not wrong to have characterized him as a bigot. And I think Coates really makes the case in this column. I think everyone should read it just so they can be attached to reality in the face of the large number of people who want to confer sainthood on this man.
I haven't read that piece yet, but I will be doing so immediately.
Yeah, it's really good. Well, Neil, this was a very serious week for us, building on a serious last week. Maybe next week we can cheer people up a little bit.
Let's hope so, but I'm not sure that's the pattern we're in right now.
We'll do what we can. And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Subscribe to Political Junkie Podcast on your favorite platform. Please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, image credits, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, or to subscribe for as little as $5 a month. This podcast is supported by paying subscribers to Political Junkie and the New School for Social Research. Today's theme is Today's Headlines by Material Girl. You can find their work on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next time.